World War II was a war that the Americans fought on two fronts. You had the European front and the Pacific front. What was taking place in the war for Europe? That's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today's topic, the war for Europe. Specifically, we're going to look at what were the major events of the war for Europe. Grab your pencil and paper, get ready to take some notes. Hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a good answer for that question. So it's December 9th, 1941. Pearl Harbor just got attacked. Congress had just issued a declaration of war against Japan. What now? We need to put the band back together, so to speak. It's time for the Allies to team up. A gentleman named Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, convinced Roosevelt that Hitler was the biggest threat in the world. He was more dangerous than the Japanese. The United States had to prioritize. Remember, this is going to be a two-front war that we're going to fight. FDR decided that Europe was more important. Hitler was the bigger threat. Let's deal with him first, then we'll take care of Japan. Something that also really helped out the Allies is that eventually Stalin came on board. Hitler went against the non-aggression pact that he had signed with the Soviet Union. Stalin was kind of ticked off about that and decided that he should join up with the Allies and take care of that little problem known as Hitler. The first major event we need to talk about is called the Battle of Britain. This happened in the summer of 1940. This was the attempt for the Nazis to basically bomb Great Britain into submission. If you'll remember from previous videos, this was a failed attempt. The British used a new technology called radar. They basically saw the bombers coming and shot them out of the sky. The second major event in Europe we need to talk about is called the Battle for the Atlantic. This starts in 1941 and really continues to the end of the war in 1945. Essentially, Hitler was using his submarines, the U-boats, to starve Great Britain. Anytime those submarines saw a cargo ship headed to Great Britain, they would do their best to sink it. When the U.S. started entering the war, the Germans were doing a phenomenal job at sinking all the supplies we were trying to send to Great Britain. But once the United States kind of got geared up for war, once the arsenal of democracy was rolling in full force, things really changed. The United States entered a class of cargo ship known as the Liberty ship into the equation. The cool thing about the Liberty ship was it was essentially basically just a floating hull. It was a big, giant cargo ship that was incredibly cheap and incredibly fast to make. Once America's economy got ramped up and the industry got going, we were cranking out Liberty ships like nobody's business. Essentially, we flat out just overwhelmed the U-boats. There were too many Liberty ships to sink. By 1943, the United States had basically won this battle for the Atlantic. There was no way Germany's submarines could sink enough of these ships fast enough to really make any difference. We're going to take just a minor detour from Europe for a second and head down to North Africa. That's the next big thing we need to talk about. Something known as Operation Torch. Operation Torch was the invasion of North Africa. Remember, that's where the Italians were. There are also quite a few Nazis there too. In November of 1942, the Allied forces invaded North Africa. This was on the urging of Churchill. Churchill thought this would be great practice to get the Allies ready for what they would face in Europe. Remember, Great Britain is the only military that had any experience fighting the Nazis, and the first time they tried that, they sort of got their butts kicked all the way back to Dunkirk. In Operation Torch, there are three major names we need to know. Two of them are U.S. commanders, and one of them is a German commander. Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton basically kind of made a name for themselves in North Africa. They were in charge and they kind of did some serious butt whipping right out of the gate. Who were they fighting against? Mostly it was a guy named Erwin Rommel. He was the German commander down there in North Africa. To his credit, Rommel was an incredibly good military strategy guy. Unfortunately, he kind of got overwhelmed by the United States and the British. It didn't take very long. By the end of 1943, the Allies more or less controlled North Africa. That became a great jumping off point for us to continue the fight. And in this case, it's going to be an invasion of Italy. For the next major event, we need to take a little bit of a detour again, this time to the Soviet Union. The thing we need to talk about is the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad came to a head in February of 1943. But let's rewind just a second. Let's talk about June 1941. This is when Hitler decided to go back on that non-aggression pact and invade the Soviet Union. It was a nasty, nasty fight. Over the course of the next few years, the Soviet Union wound up losing 1.1 million soldiers and just about as many civilians. This all came to a kind of a head in a city known as Stalingrad. Joseph Stalin basically told the Soviets that they were going to make a stand here, and there's no way that they're going to let the Germans advance any farther and take over his country. Stalin also had something else that worked really well in his favor. That was the Soviet winter. Because the winter of 1943 was a nasty Soviet winter the Germans just weren't prepared for. As the battle for Stalingrad kind of ensued, the Germans, they basically just ran out of supplies and the will to fight. Hitler had issued orders to his troops to not surrender. But by February 1943, most of the Nazis in Stalingrad were so incredibly worn out and had absolutely nothing in the way of supplies, they had no other option but to surrender. This really marked a major turning point in the war for the Allies. This was the first time that basically Germany lost. By September 1943, the United States and Great Britain was ready to tackle Europe proper. The first step they were going to take was an invasion of Italy. That invasion was called Operation Avalanche. The idea was we're going to jump into Sicily real quick first. And in case you're wondering what Sicily is basically the football that the boot of Italy is getting ready to kick. The idea is we'd jump into Sicily, take that island real fast, then hop over to Italy proper and work our way up the boot. Well, this happened pretty quickly. Sicily and southern Italy fell really fast. The Allies made it about halfway up Italy to a place called Anzio. They got there by January of 1944. But when they got there, they met something they weren't quite ready for. Hitler was bound and determined to keep Allied forces off German soil. In order to do that, he knew he had to stop the Allies from invading Italy. So he sent some of his biggest, baddest, most battle-hardened troops to block the way. This is where the battle for Anzio gets its name. It's called Bloody Anzio. With a name like Bloody Anzio, can you guess what the fighting was going to be like? Things really kind of bogged down from there, and really and truly, the battle for Italy really didn't end until mid-1945, when the war for Europe itself was basically over. By June of 1944, the Allies were ready to take France back, basically. This was a plan known as Operation Overlord. The idea was, let's liberate France, that'll give us more people to help us out, and it'll give us a great direct path into Germany. The first major step in Operation Overlord happened on June 4th, 1944. Historians remember it simply as D-Day. The idea was the Allies were going to split into 5 groups and they were going to attack the beaches of Normandy. If they could get onto those beaches and establish what was known as a foothold, that would make the prime spot for more and more Allied troops to be able to flood into France. Luckily, D-Day was a success, and we got that foothold we needed. From there, it was just going to be a matter of time before the Nazis fell. Not long after D-Day, after we got our foothold in France, the Nazis basically were on the run. They were headed back to Germany. Things looked great from June until about December 1944. By December 1944, the Germans had been pushed well back into Belgium. Unfortunately, they tried a kind of a sneaky counterattack. To them, it was known as the Ardennes counteroffensive. To the Allies, it was simply known as the Battle of the Bulge. Essentially, the Germans basically turned around and charged back at our lines. If you look at the map right up here, you can kind of see where the name Battle of the Bulge comes from. When the Germans counterattacked, they pushed our lines back pretty significantly and created a big giant bulge, hence the Battle of the Bulge. Fortunately for us, the Germans were so worn out and so short on supplies, they just couldn't sustain that counterattack. Eventually the bulge collapsed back in, and the Allies kept pushing the German army back into Germany. And that brings us to April of 1945. April of 1945 was an incredibly important month. Two big events happened. The first is on April 12th, 1945, and it's kind of a sad one. On April 12th, Franklin Roosevelt, the guy who had been leading the country since the early 1930s, died of a stroke. His vice president, a guy named Harry Truman, took over. When Truman took over, he essentially urged America to win the war for FDR. FDR had put just about everything he had into this war, and it was only right that we win the war in his honor. That really boosted America's morale and really kind of gave us that final push we needed to end the war in Europe. The second big event happened on April 30th, 1945, and is kind of a less sad event. What happened on that evening is Adolf Hitler wrote a final letter to the German people. In that letter, he blamed, of course, the Jews for all Germany's problems because that was Hitler's go-to. But in the letter, he also blamed his generals for basically losing the war. He said that they wouldn't follow the orders that he gave them, and because of that, Germany was going to lose the war. When he got done writing the letter, he decided to commit suicide. He pulled a pistol out and shot himself in the head. At least that's what the official historic story is. We can go on and on about all the different conspiracy theories that are out there about what happened to Hitler, but as far as class goes, let's stick to the official historic story. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. With Hitler out of the picture, it's really only a short matter of time before Germany finally ends the war, decides to surrender. That actually happened on May 8th, or possibly 9th, it really depends on who you ask, of 1945, and has become known as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. The Allies were closing in on the capital of Germany, Berlin. From the east was the Soviet Union. They were kind of in the lead. They were going to reach Berlin first. The United States and Great Britain were coming from the west. When it came down to it, the Germans knew that if they surrendered to the Soviet Union, things would be bad. Like, really bad. So they fought very hard to hold out as long as they could for the United States and Great Britain to arrive. They said it's much better to surrender to the United States than it would be to the Soviet Union. The United States and Great Britain are going to treat us so much better than Stalin is. Well, they fought hard and they held out until May 8th. As soon as America and Great Britain showed up, the Germans surrendered unconditionally to General Eisenhower. War in Europe is officially over. Okay, so what's important to take away from this video? Number one, remember that the first real battle for the United States was the battle for the Atlantic. And we won that battle because of numbers. Takeaway number two, the road to victory in Europe really started in North Africa. And number three, don't forget that D-Day was the true turning point for the war in Europe. Had that not been successful, there's no telling what might have happened. Alright guys, there you go. The war for Europe. Hopefully you got great notes. Hopefully you're going to be ready when that quiz happens in class. As always, till next time, remember, don't stop learning.